All right, 10th grade. Time to look at the Industrial Revolution and its effects. We're going to be splitting this up over a couple days. So, first, we're going to look at the environmental and economic effects of the Industrial Revolution. So, let's start. First, raw resources. As we talked about yesterday, the Industrial Revolution requires the use of many fossil fuels, which are deep in the ground, which are fuels that have been developed over thousands of years of the movement of the earth. Don't know why I'm talking about this part, but anyway. Our two big fossil fuels that are going to be used are coal and oil. Coal during the first Industrial Revolution, oil during the second Industrial Revolution that happens in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But both coal and oil are not easy to extract or get out of the ground. Both require deep digging underground, which poisons and ruins the land around it. Not only that, the burning of coal and oil creates smog and fumes that are unhealthy for both people and the environment. So digging up and using coal and oil is going to hurt the environment over time. Second, as the population increases thanks to industrialization, people are going to need to use more and more and more raw resources. Anything from wood to animals to things that are grown from the ground, but there's just more need as more people exist. Not only that, people tend to live more and more in cities. People who live in cities require even more raw resources to fuel cities, to provide for their needs, things like that. So the increase in population is also going to put a strain on raw resources, which is going to put a strain on the environment. Overall, the environmental strain is really only going to get worse thanks to the Industrial Revolution, especially because early on, people did not realize the effect that they're having on the earth. The increased cutting down of forests made it harder to grow food, it allowed fires to spread faster, things like that. Increased harvests would often deplete soil. And then not only that, the building of more cities, the building more places to live, the increase in railroads only harmed the environment even more. We also want to look at how factories and trade affected the environment as well. First, factories had very few rules about how they affected the environment. Once again, not really much knowledge and also very little care about what happened to the environment. People just kind of assumed everything would be okay. So factories often existed on water, such as rivers, or near seas or things like that, because it was, one, easy to get the resources you need by water trade, by boats, but also it was really easy to just throw your waste into the rivers. So it was very common in these cities that sat on rivers for factories to just pollute and over time destroy these rivers. And what happened is that the poor were the ones who generally had to use river water to survive. So what occurred is that waves upon waves of very dirty water would lead to diseases that ravaged poor communities. Second, to live, most poor people had to live near the factories in cities. Factories gave off a lot of smog, a lot of smoke, which both hurt the environment but also hurt people who had to breathe in that smog and that smoke. And people who lived near these factories often lived in very terrible conditions. We'll get into more about that tomorrow. But overall, this lack of sanitation or understanding of cleanliness, both in the environment and people, hurt the environment, poisoned it, but also hurt people who often face disease and illness from these factories and industrialization as a whole. Cool, we're going to pause here, and you guys are going to answer question 1. Go ahead and go. Cool, so you've hypothetically answered question 1. We're now going to question 2, section for question 2. We're going to look at the economic factors now of industrialization. First, the production of goods. The production of goods is now completely centered in factories. And this use of factories to make goods is going to completely change how and where things are produced. First, factories are usually located at the center of trade, either on rivers or on really important roads. Whereas before, people would either make their goods locally, buy them locally, or get them at a local market. All goods are now going to be produced, majority, in these factories where hundreds of machines are and people work en masse. These factories are usually located, as I said, on rivers and important trade areas. So one, people are going to move to the factories. Remember, people need work, so they're going to move to these factories. This is going to lead to the development of new cities and the growth of old cities as factories become more popular and people move to work in these factories. This is also going to lead to people living in what we call tenement housing or tight housing Apartment buildings are very little space. We'll get into more of that tomorrow. But factories basically change how things are produced. They're produced faster, they're produced cheaper and more consistently, which vastly increases the wealth of people who own these factories. But what we see is how labor is affected by these use of factories as well. So how does labor change? First, people basically lose jobs in large amounts to what people have traditionally been working at. So most people throughout history were majority farmers, or they produced basic items, clothing, tools, things like that. These are all things that can now be improved through technology. Farming uses technology. You need a lot less people to farm. All of these tools, clothes, items that used to be made by hand can now be made in factories. So what happens? People have to move and leave their villages to go move to cities where these factories are located. Mika, stop. Where these factories are located. Not only that, this means one, they're leaving a place that their family had most likely lived for generations, but two, this is a community that would have supported you when you faced hard times. This also changed the nature of their labor. When they lived in villages, people made money off the work of their hands, what they produced or what they grew. They're basically their own boss. They made money by growing things and selling it. As people move to factories, how their labor is used completely changes. First, people now have to work for somebody. When you're working at a factory, you're working for somebody. That's called wage labor. That means these workers now relied upon and were completely dependent on the rich who owned the factories to pay their wages. And these wages were basically a way that the rich could control workers. So now people had to work hourly for a wage, often just enough to survive on. So this overall gave the rich, or those who owned factories, a lot of power over people who now worked in factories. If they withheld your wages, you'd be done for. If they reduced it, that could severely hurt your livelihood. And they could also incentivize you with small wage improvements. So what this meant basically is that these poor workers who now had to move and live in cities where they had little few connections, they had to work at these factories, were dependent on this wage labor because they often had very little savings and had to use almost all their money for home and food. So basically this changed the dynamic where people, yes, were relied upon to their lord or whoever ran the land in the area, but they still had a measure of independence and could rely on their community, now are completely tied to these wages and the people who pay those wages. Cool, you're going to pause here and answer that second question. Go ahead and go. Now moving on to the third part of our lecture. The Industrial Revolution's economic effect on the world. First, trade increased immensely. World trade specifically. So now, even more so than before, we have less trade just within region and local, and even more trade happening worldwide. This is mostly because of the steam engine. This allows steam ships to travel farther and faster. That means trade is easier and cheaper, so it's more likely to happen. We also have railroads, which are connecting local communities, regional communities, and even between states and regions. So these railroads both improve trade, as people can now get raw resources from farther away for cheaper. But it also means that if I make a good, I can ship this good across the world and still make a lot of money off it. So this world trade increases thanks to new technology. Increased world trade increases wealth, primarily for the people who are making these industrial goods for Europe. This actually leads to a huge change Europe goes through that we're going to talk about in upcoming days. The end of mercantilism. Europeans are not going to benefit from reducing the amount of trade they can have or who they can trade with. Mercantilism made sense when they made all their money from colonies, but now they're making a lot of money from trade. So it actually makes sense for European countries to try to trade with more people than just with their colonies. So mercantilist policies end, and a new economic policy known as free trade, laissez-faire economics, written by Adam Smith, becomes more popular. What laissez-faire means basically is that there should be as little rules on trade and business as possible. So Europeans are now allowing their businessmen and their merchants and their traders to trade with whoever, however they want, and whatever items they want to. The idea is that the market or people will decide the best action. So mercantilism ends. This affects how European countries work with their colonies and with other countries, but we're not going to get into that right now. Europeans' global trade. Europe becomes the primary producer of the world. Remember, we talked about, and when we started the Industrial Revolution, how Ottoman Empire, China, India produced a lot of goods. Manufactured is another way to think about it. Manufactured a lot of finished goods. What happens is that thanks to this increase in world trade and this increase of free trade, Europeans start to have a larger and larger share of world trade, manufacturing particularly. So Europe is now producing more and more and more goods that people around the world are using. This means that places that used to manufacture a lot of goods have less of a share. The Middle East and Asia now are producing less and less. They're still manufacturing goods. China's still making goods. India's still making goods. Ottoman Empire's still making goods, but less than they used to. What this means is that areas that used to produce certain goods, textiles in India, ironworks in India, textiles in Egypt, shipbuilding in Asia, all of these things are now being produced more by Europeans, which starts to make these areas, Asia, India, the Middle East, start to become more of raw resource producers than they do manufacturers. So Europe starts to take more and more percentage of global trade. Mika, I threw it over there. I threw it right there.
What could I cut?
This is where you're going to pause here, and you're going to answer question 3.